Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in, and in this video we're going to talk about a very important subject which is pretty much a continuing factor from the previous video, but I thought this is just very deep and I was contemplating about making a video about it or not, because we kind of created this channel talking about these little tips or tricks or the suggestions that basically will be provided to the viewers if we break down the system, and not really about advocacy, although that was always in the back of my head to kind of break down the system so you guys will see the holes and the gaps as an immigrant or as these curious parents who either want to move here or have their kids in this educational system enrolled, and you start talking about it, or your kids, if they're watching this, start talking about it. But I thought that if we are talking about immigrants, if we're talking about their problems, if we're talking about how the system is unjust towards them, it's a very important factor to also talk about why, to this day, despite this country being built on immigrants, right? Even these white peoples that majority of Hollywood movies perpetrate them as a true American, their ancestors came from different countries, right? So if immigration has been going on in this country and one generation at least has to deal with all these problems, right? And no matter what age they come, they have all these different problems. But then their kids, if they're moving here with their kids, if they have kids here, they have separate set of problems. And why there aren't any regulations or rules for them to not suffer in this unjust system. And I say that because basically I mentioned the situation with disabled students and how they have rules and regulations in this country that will force institutions and the professors to provide them with these accommodations. Otherwise, they can be legally going through a process of justifying why they haven't provided these accommodations, which majority of the times is just unreasonable, because if it's part of the law, then they have to do it. They have to provide it. But why us immigrants don't have any accommodations? And I want to open up a parenthesis here. By saying that immigrants are receiving accommodations, we're not saying even these accommodations are making the system perfect. My point in here, because as a disabled student, I know even with those accommodations, it's not enough, and the system is still putting minority groups, it can be disabled students or anyone else, not at the position that they are competing with other students fairly. So please don't take this video the wrong way. Please don't take this message the wrong way. I am simply talking about why to this day there is some sort of flaw in the system that we, the immigrant students who move here, who want to perfect our education, who want to improve our situation by studying, by receiving higher degrees, by going through all the challenges that we have to, despite not knowing the language, not knowing the culture, but we still take it in and want to go and receive a higher education. Why there aren't any regulation for us that will help us, And specifically I'm talking about in the educational system, not so much about like other sections of immigration, because there are laws, good or bad, on those sections. But you don't really see that much of the regulations or laws for us, for immigrant students. And one of the reasons, so we're going to get into these reasons, right? This was like an introductory and what I'm about to tackle in this video. But one of the withdrawals or the problems in this system is that we just learn to take it in. We move here, we don't know the language, they put us in these ESL classes that, despite being helpful for us one way or another, right, by teaching us the language, they're also limiting us from taking all these classes that we require, that we need in order to apply for universities. But we're like, that's the system. Just deal with it. As an example, I went through the entire high school I moved here in November of 2013, if I'm not mistaken, October or November, right? I was in a different country for a year, and before that in Iran, and therefore I didn't have my full educational transcript and everything set up. Every summer, I sat next to all those students who failed their classes because they didn't pay attention, they didn't give a crap, and take these credited classes in order to have the credits. So I, at the end of my senior year, can apply to universities. When my peers, those people who were at the top of their class, were taking internships, were working jobs, were working in different offices that they could use in their resumes and make them look good when they were applying, especially when we're talking about top-ranking universities, I never had the opportunity. And people like me, there were a lot of them. I would see great students who show up to these summer classes. I had to stay after school for 7th period in a class that maybe had 2 people, including me. After school, your school from 8:15 a.m. to 2:35 p.m. At least that was a time period for us, or for my class. And then after the bell rang and everybody ran to go home or hold their girlfriend's hand, we had to go to another class, take these online courses for students who failed their classes in order to get those credits. So me, from starting high school to pretty much a semester before I graduated from UC Berkeley, never had a time off because I was always behind. Because either when I was in a university transferring, I didn't have certain credits that all those people who were already at that university had the opportunity to take them, and or like I was in high school, got here late, there was no regulation that would be like, hey, these people are migrating from one country to another country to another country, so of course they will be behind. What should we do about them? What should we do about their situation? But we were told, oh, just take it. That's the situation here in the US. And we kept our mouth shut, and a lot of immigrant students just do the same. We kept our mouth shut because either we don't know the system, we don't know who we should go to in order to raise our voice, in order to advocate for our needs. And that's where I get to my second point. Not only we learned to take it and kept our mouths shut, but second, those who are representing us, in majority of the cases, they're not immigrants. They don't understand us because they never felt this pain of being behind, of being laughed at, of being so disappointed because you don't know certain things, right? And others are laughing at you, or others don't value you because just you don't have that knowledge. And they don't understand it, so why would they advocate for you? Or even if you go to their offices, they will like, oh yes, sure, thank you for mentioning that point. But he or she picked up that point, that specific part of the point that you've mentioned that they wanted to. Oh yeah, I think he's right because of this. They undermine the entire sentence by doing that. They undermine the entire argument by doing that because that's the only part out of the whole conversation that they took that they understand, that they're willing to understand. So look at those who are representing us. And that's the second problem, which leads to the third, because I know what is the argument here. I've heard it, right? And I've seen it in my advocacy. Because now we have certain people who are identifying themselves as an immigrant and representing immigrants, when in reality They moved here when they were so young that they picked up the system and how it works. They picked up the language. They can speak fluently with a perfect accent. They know all these tips and tricks that I had to fall through all of them in order to learn them. They've been told. Again, they know how to speak the language very well. They know how to grammatically, perfectly write these sentences, so it won't take them 2 or 3 times as it does for us to write, to read, to understand it. Yet they're immigrants. And they identify themselves as an immigrant. Because they moved here when they were 7 years old. When they were 10 years old. Not when they were 20. Right? When picking up the language is harder for them. When they now have to work on top of going to school. When they have other responsibilities if they're coming with an individual that have some needs like myself. And my disabled father. Right? So I'm saying we shouldn't kick them out completely out of equation and be like, oh, because you were born here, but your parents migrated here, now you are not an immigrant. Or because you moved here when you were so young, you should not be considered as an immigrant. I feel like that's an unfair argument to bring up here, and this was not my point. My point is that the immigrant community should understand that this is a problem here, and we should start developing a specific language in order to resolve this problem. So those who are moving here recently, they should be identifying themselves as with a certain word versus those who were born here or moved here when they were so young. For example, if you were born here or you moved here when you were so young, you can say that, oh, I'm a first-gen immigrant. First-generation immigrant. Versus those who just moved here or moved here later on in their life when they have an accent and all of this, they can say, I'm an immigrant. Maybe something like that. That's just a suggestion. But I'm saying, like, we need to have a different language in order to tackle this problem. Why? Now let's get to the fourth factor. Because they're all related to one another as I was trying to put them next to one another in order for you guys to understand perfectly. Because when I was advocating for immigrant rights, for immigrations, and for immigrant students to receive these accommodations, you know what the professor will tell me? They will tell me that yes, I understand what you're saying, but I also have immigrant students who performing as well as everybody else in this class. As a matter of fact, in certain cases, they even do better. They don't have an accent. And yet they just moved from China. They just moved from Australia. They just moved from Austria. They just moved from South Korea. I've heard that a ton of time when I was advocating for ESL accommodations campaign. And the problem is right there because a lot of people don't recognize these students are often at the higher hierarchy in their country, higher level in their country when their parents are often wealthy, that they send them to international schools. So they picked up the language from the very young age because that was the purpose of these schools. They will basically set them up so if they have to migrate to another country in order to pursue a higher education, their English is on that level. And I ran into a lot of them at Berkeley. The girl who was born in Turkey, who moved here 12 months ago, when I was here for 8 years, she could speak the language fluently. Never needed any ESL classes because she passed through the exam. And it's like, okay, she's immigrant and I'm an immigrant. And I have these needs when she can perform as well as someone who was born here. So it's like, it's fascinating for me that how come a 50 years old professor who has all these credentials cannot recognize this factor. And a 20 years old has to get up and basically identify these problems, identify the roots of these problems, and how these two things are different. So here are the 4 factors. I hope this video was helpful to you, and I'm sorry if I'm if my voice is very passionate, but it really matters to me. This is a very important subject, and I feel like when we recognize the problems and the roots of the problems, that's when we can start attacking them and come up with solutions. Alright, I hope this video was helpful to you. I will try to make more videos about this problem, and this is a very important concern to me. Until then, please follow this channel and have a good evening, or whenever you're watching this.